The dusty highway stretched endlessly ahead, nothing but desert and heat shimmering on the horizon. Hank had seen a lot of things in his years on the road, but a makeshift roadblock in the middle of nowhere? That was new. A gang of masked men stood there, smirking, thinking they had him trapped. They didn't know this old trucker had been through worse, and they were about to learn the hard way. They thought they could stop a seasoned trucker. Big mistake. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more epic stories. The sun hung low over the desert highway, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Dust swirled in the dry breeze as an old but well-maintained Peterbilt rumbled down the lonely road. Behind the wheel, Jack Callahan, a veteran trucker with over 30 years on the road, adjusted his grip and squinted toward the horizon. Something didn't sit right. Up ahead, a group of men stood across the two-lane road, their vehicles parked haphazardly to block the way. They weren't police. They weren't DOT inspectors. They were something worse: opportunists, the kind that preyed on travelers who had the bad luck of being alone. Jack had seen their kind before, but he had never been one to spook easily. Slowing down just enough to take in the situation, Jack sized them up. 5 men, all in dark suits, but the cheap kind that didn't quite fit right. Their faces were covered with black masks, and at least 2 of them were carrying rifles, their muzzles pointed downward but ready to be lifted in an instant. Amateurs. The real professionals wouldn't have let him spot their weapons so easily. Jack exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, as he brought his rig to a stop about 20 yards away. He could see the confidence in the way they carried themselves, the arrogance of men who had gotten away with this before. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward and motioned for Jack to come out. Jack didn't move. Another man tapped on the hood of a nearby SUV impatiently. "Get out, old man!" he barked. Jack rolled his shoulders, reached for the thermos in his cup holder, and took a slow sip. The men outside watched, clearly irritated by his lack of urgency. The tall man, who Jack assumed was the leader, took another step forward. "Come on now, let's not make this difficult," he said with a smirk. "Step out. Let's have a little chat." Jack finally opened his door, stepping out onto the hot pavement. He didn't raise his hands, didn't show fear. That alone unsettled them. "Boys," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're making a mistake." The leader chuckled. "That's cute. You see, old-timer, this here's a toll road now. And the price? Well, let's just say that depends on how much you got in that rig." Jack leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. "That so?" Another man scoffed. "You deaf? This ain't a negotiation." Jack let the silence stretch. He saw them shift on their feet, uncomfortable with how relaxed he was. They wanted him scared. They wanted him desperate. Instead, he was sizing them up, taking in every detail: the way they held their weapons, the way they glanced at each other for reassurance. Jack smirked. "You boys ever seen what happens when someone blocks the wrong truck?" The leader narrowed his eyes. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Jack didn't answer. He just glanced back at his rig. The men exchanged looks. Something wasn't right. The leader's smirk faltered as Jack remained still, his arms crossed like he had all the time in the world. The masked men weren't used to this. They were used to drivers panicking, fumbling for their wallets, pleading for an easy way out. But Jack? He didn't look the least bit worried. The tension thickened. One of the men, shorter, stockier, more impatient, stepped forward and jabbed a finger toward Jack's chest. "What's your problem, old man? You think this is a joke?" Jack's expression didn't change. "I think you boys are used to scaring the wrong people." That set them off. The stocky man growled and grabbed Jack by the front of his shirt, yanking him forward. "I don't like your attitude." Jack didn't flinch. He could feel the guy's hand shaking, whether from anger or nerves, he couldn't tell. The leader held up a hand, stopping the situation from boiling over too fast. All right, he said, feigning patience. "Let's try this again." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "We're businessmen, you see, and you're sitting on a valuable shipment. Now I can't imagine you'd rather lose that than just cooperate." Jack tilted his head. "Cooperate?" The leader grinned. "That's right. You hand over what's in that trailer, and maybe we let you keep your truck." Jack glanced over at his Peterbilt, then back at the men. "That's a nice offer." The leader's grin widened. "Thought so." Jack leaned in slightly. One problem. The men tensed. Yeah? Jack's smile faded. I don't negotiate with dead men. That was the last straw. The stocky man snapped, shoving Jack backward. Enough of this crap! He reached for the pistol on his belt. And that was when Jack moved. Before the man's fingers could wrap around the grip, Jack grabbed his wrist and twisted it, hard. A sickening pop filled the air as the stocky man screamed, his gun clattering to the ground. The others reacted instantly, yanking their weapons up. But Jack wasn't standing there anymore. In one swift motion, he stepped back, his hands already reaching for the cab door. The men barely had time to process what was happening before they heard it, the deep roar of an engine coming to life. The Peterbilt's engine rumbled like a beast waking up from slumber. The gang hesitated for just one second too long. Jack was already in the cab, slamming the door shut. Get him out of there, the leader barked, his men scrambling. One of them yanked a pistol from his belt, aiming at the windshield. But before he could fire, Jack's foot hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, its massive grille surging ahead like an iron wall. The roadblock wasn't just some flimsy barrier, it was a stack of wooden pallets reinforced with metal beams. But against 40 tons of roaring steel, it might as well have been paper. The gang barely had time to dive out of the way before the truck slammed into their blockade. Wood splintered, metal screeched, and debris exploded into the air like a bomb had gone off. The shockwave knocked two of the thugs off their feet. Jack didn't stop. The truck plowed through, tires grinding the shattered remains beneath them. The gang scattered, some stumbling, others diving for cover. The leader stood frozen, watching his perfect ambush crumble into dust. Jack's voice rang out over the growl of the engine. You boys picked the wrong truck. He yanked the wheel, sending the rig into a sharp turn, dust and debris swirling in his wake. One of the men, panicked, fired a shot, but it ricocheted harmlessly off the truck's reinforced cab. Jack grinned. They thought he was just some old driver. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And now? They were about to find out. Jack wasn't the kind of man to start a fight, but if one came his way, he sure as hell knew how to finish it. The gang leader stumbled to his feet, dust and splinters clinging to his jacket. His men were in chaos, some lying flat on their backs, groaning, others scrambling to pick up their weapons. But it didn't matter. They had already lost. Jack threw the truck into reverse, the massive wheels grinding over the wreckage of their so-called blockade. He rolled down the window, letting out a slow, taunting chuckle. You boys look like you weren't expecting that, he called out. The gang leader, red-faced and humiliated, pulled out his pistol and aimed at the cab. His hands shook. Jack didn't even flinch. Go ahead, Jack said, his voice calm, almost amused. Take the shot. The gang leader hesitated. The weight of the moment hit him. He wasn't dealing with a scared trucker. He was dealing with a man who had nothing to lose. One of the gang members, still sprawled on the ground, groaned. Boss, let's just go. Shut up, the leader snapped, his face twisted with rage. Jack smirked. That's the first smart thing I've heard all day. He revved the engine, and the sound alone made the gang flinch. That was the moment it sunk in. They had gone after the wrong guy, and now the whole town would know it. A few onlookers had gathered at a distance, truckers from a nearby diner, folks who had heard the commotion. They stood with their arms crossed, shaking their heads at the gang's pathetic attempt at intimidation. One of the truckers, a burly man in a grease-stained cap, chuckled. That's them? That's the big bad gang that was supposed to run this stretch of road? Laughter spread through the small crowd. The gang leader's face turned pale. Respect was everything in their world, and right now, he had none. Jack leaned out of his truck window. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to pick up your trash, get in your cars, and disappear. And if I see you on this road again? He let the words hang for a moment. Then he threw the truck into gear and gunned it forward just enough to send a blast of dust and gravel flying straight at them. The gang flinched, coughing and stumbling back. One of them fell on his ass, dropping his gun. More laughter from the onlookers. The gang leader gritted his teeth, his whole body shaking with rage and shame. This was worse than losing a fight. This was public humiliation. With no other option, he turned to his men. Let's go. They didn't argue. Jack watched as they piled into their cars and sped off, tails tucked between their legs. One of the truckers walked up to Jack's window, grinning. Damn, son, you sure know how to make an exit. Jack shrugged. a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ain't about how you start a fight," he said, shifting into gear. "It's about making sure they don't come back." And with that, he drove off, leaving the gang in the dust, their reputation in ruins. Jack had been on the road long enough to know one simple truth. There are two kinds of people in this world, those who take from others, and those who stand their ground. As he drove down the open highway, the remnants of the roadblock disappearing in his rearview mirror, he felt a familiar sense of peace settle over him. He had been in situations like this before. He had dealt with bullies, with cowards who hid behind numbers, with men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. And he knew one thing for certain: men like that always folded when they were faced with someone who wouldn't back down. Jack reached for the radio, tuning in to an old country station. The twang of a steel guitar filled the cab, mixing with the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine. His fingers tapped against the wheel, his mind drifting to everything that had just happened. What had those punks really expected? That an old trucker like him would just give in? That he'd be scared? They had picked the wrong man, the wrong truck, and the wrong day. He chuckled to himself. Maybe, just maybe, they'd learn something today. Maybe they'd think twice before trying to push someone else around. Or maybe they'd just go find another poor fool to terrorize. Jack sighed. That was the world. Some men never learned. But he wasn't in the business of saving lost souls. He was in the business of getting from point A to point B, keeping his truck rolling, and making sure no one got in his way. As he passed a small roadside diner, he spotted a few truckers outside watching the road. One of them, a grizzled man with a thick beard, gave him a knowing nod. Word traveled fast. Jack nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. Because out here, on the endless stretch of blacktop, truckers looked out for their own. And no matter how bad the world got, there would always be men like Jack, men who wouldn't let the bullies win. He shifted in his seat, rolling down the window as the cool evening air rushed in. Another night, another road. That was the life, and it was a damn good one. What about you? Have you ever stood your ground when someone tried to push you around? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to prove you weren't as easy a target as they thought? Drop your story in the comments below, we'd love to hear it. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories from the road, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.